Hello class, my name is Connie Goff and I would like to talk about factors that interfered with women composers. Before getting in depth with this topic, I wanted to discuss why I chose this topic. First of all, women in society have always been fighting to be equal or to at least get in the same place as men are or have always been. And this factor have not only influenced women, although all women, but have also influenced women composers throughout the eras. Women composers have been in the shadow of male composers. How? We will see more as we get through this presentation. The first thing I can tell you is that there's always been bias and gender inequality, not only with them, but with all women. But we're going to discuss more of why women composers and how they had it and how hard they had it. There are many factors that have interfered with the success of women composers. However, there are three that really stick out of the list. The first one is gender stereotyping, the second one is men controlling women's lives, and the third one is no access to formal education. Women in the older eras really struggle because they have a lot of gender bias, such as women seen as the weaker sex, such as women seen as dependable, like women could not do anything without men or be somebody without men. These struggles have been reflected with women composers. These women struggle to be recognized or even admired as a composer because of that male shadowing. The first factor I want to discuss is called gender stereotyping. From this research, one of the main things that really stick out was that women were expected to only play feminine instruments. This excluded all brass, percussion, and string instruments. The only instruments that women were allowed to play were the lute, the piano, or the harpsichord. Other than that, if you wanted to pursue some other instrument, you were not allowed to do it because it was not considered a feminine instrument. This happened throughout the Renaissance, Baroque, and Classical period. Women were not allowed to do anything else but the three instruments mentioned because they were the only feminine instruments or feminine enough instruments that women could play. The third factor to be discussed is that men control women's lives. Throughout the Renaissance, throughout the Baroque, throughout the Classical, and even throughout the Romantic period, men were still controlling women's lives. How? Women were still controlled by their husbands, fathers, or any male authority in their lives. This rule also affected any women. It didn't matter the society class she was in. She was still under the control of male authority in her life. Now, the third factor that affected women composers was that women did not have access to formal education. The only way women could actually have some education and some formal education was through attending a convent. In other words, you have to become a nun and serve the church for your entire life in order to receive some formal education. This was very unfair to all women, but since we're focusing on women composers, this was very unfair to women composers because male in general could actually attend school and receive private education and receive education in music and actually get knowledge and become better. However, women did not have that opportunity, could not attend school, could not actually do something with their lives because they weren't actually allowed or even provided the tools to become somebody. Not only do we have those three important aspects affecting women composers, but on top of that, we have other two important aspects that really affected women composers' development. The first one is that the church played a very important role in the foundation of music, including the selection and approval of music. This really affected women composers because who dominated the church, or who the church was made of, was male. And male had the power. So in other words, men had the power to pick what music they were gonna play or what music was they were going to approve. And even if there were some music composed by female, men would usually lean toward what their men composers did instead of what women composers did during that time. This culture and society were two important elements that deeply influenced women composers. In the medieval and the Renaissance, society and culture was surrounded and dominated by the Catholic Church. The next aspect affecting women composers was that music became more complex, therefore the demand of educated, trained composers rose. Yes, it is great that music progressed throughout the eras. However, we're forgetting the fact that music progressed, but it was more through what male did, or male found out what men composers were doing. Because during the Renaissance era, women were not allowed to have any education. So music became and evolved throughout the centuries, but however, culture was still controlled by men. Music became more complex, because it involved larger orchestras, and then society would like this music. So instead of actually going to a smaller concert, maybe like a gathering, like what they used to do in the Renaissance, society actually preferred the bigger and more, just the bigger and larger works for concert halls. This type of music require really trained and educated composers, which were aspects that women did not have access to back then. So when it came to pick what music society preferred best, they leaned towards what the men were doing, which were more demanding compositions. The first composer I wanted to discuss, because she did a lot with the life that she had and in the era that she lived. Her name is Hildegard von Bingen, and she was a brilliant women composer from the medieval period. She spent her entire life as a nun. She became recognized as a composer, even in a time that men ruled actually everything. However, she composed this music by using, yes, the standards that the men had. However, she was able to compose her own music and use her own creativity by adding extra stuff to her music. Hildegard added text painting and added extended melismas to her compositions just because she wanted to express more meaning to the words that she was talking about in her compositions. These two things were things that were not actually approved or were not music standard in the medieval era. Women composers have struggled to be recognized and admired like their male counterparts due to gender stereotyping, men controlling women's lives, and no access to formal education. However, there are some exceptions that can demonstrate the capacity that women have always had, even from early eras like the medieval era. Hildegard is one of the several women to be discussed. These women's life demonstrated the inequality and shows how hard it was to obtain success in a world dominated by men.